Hello, my name is Dan Heaton and I am the co-host of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast. The following interview was taken from episode 28 of the podcast. If you enjoyed this interview and would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to the podcast via the usual podcast apps and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to welcome now to the podcast Councillor Jeet Bains, the Conservative Councillor for Addiscombe East Ward here in Croydon. Jeet, welcome to the podcast and thanks for agreeing to speak to us.
Well, thanks, Dan, for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you.
So first things first, before we get into any politics at all, how are you coping with the lockdown?
All good so far. Thank you for asking. I'm keeping myself and my family safe at home. And so, yeah, touch wood, we're all good. I have elderly parents who are also in Croydon. So they're good as well. You know how it is. You have to check that your family's okay, but it's all good. How is it with you and yours?
My parents were on a cruise when it all kicked off, so they had to get flown back from the Caribbean and had the holiday cut short. But for myself, I've been okay really because I'm able to work from home for the most part if I need to. So I'm glad to say I've not been furloughed or anything like that. So it's all's well with me.
Good, glad to hear it.
So, Jeet, you were interviewed by us back in January, and you'd not long been since you were the parliamentary candidate for the Conservatives up in Luton.
Yeah.
And you talked to us a little bit about the campaign up there in obviously the general election back in December. And you said at the time, throughout the campaign, I felt that the electorate had a clear choice between a Marxist agenda from Labour and an economy boosting agenda from the Conservatives. What do you think the main lessons were for all the parties from the last general election?
Yes. So what I meant by that comment was in previous elections, I remember people used to complain that all the parties are the same, and people even used to say that David Cameron looked like a copy of Blair and Clegg looked like Cameron, and they all looked the same even. And I don't know if you remember, people always used to talk about winning the centre ground because that's where you could mop up votes. And I felt last year's election in particular was not that. So Jeremy Corbyn, for example, he in no way represented a thing called the centre ground. And Boris Johnson was clear, for example, on Brexit, and just his force of personality meant he was a completely distinct figure from Blair or Cameron. So that's what I meant, that the choice this time round was really clear. There was it was not the case that it was two candidates sort of saying the same thing. This time, on the one hand, you had an avowedly hard left Labour candidate who was quite open about nationalising great swathes of the British economy. We had a Chancellor, if you remember, in the Houses of Parliament, in the House of Commons. In his early days, he threw Mao's little red book across to George Osborne and said, have that. That's what I'm all about. So you had people like that on one side, and a party who was, in my view, they reeked of anti-Semitism. You had that party on one side, and on the other side, the choice was, Boris. So it was a very stark choice, unlike before, and that's what I kind of meant by that there was a clear choice. So I think, for me, the lessons were, I would say, number one, the leader matters. The leader always matters, but it really showed this time the leader matters. Corbyn was just an immensely flawed character who was found wanting on so many levels. I think also another lesson would be, I found that there are just certain things that the British people will not countenance. So, for example, Marxism, however you dress it up, nobody in Britain is interested in Marxism. We found that out this time around, if we needed to. Prejudice, the British people won't put up with prejudice. I had a feeling that Labour, perhaps they calculated that anti-Semitism wasn't a vote loser and maybe they could indulge some of their extreme elements without damaging them electorally. Maybe that was their calculation, I don't know. But if it was, they were wrong. I think quietly, privately, the British people will not put up with that kind of prejudice. I think another lesson was, particularly for Labour, you can't have an awful front bench. I mean, I just thought their front bench was shocking. Let's just leave that there. I won't go into the names. A couple of other ones, I think, in terms of lessons from the Lib Dems. You need it was clear you need a credible leader, but also somebody who's believable. So, for example, Jo Swinson, who kept on calling herself the next prime minister, it just wasn't credible. It kind of went beyond laughable, and I think she dropped it a bit too late in the day. And if you look at her exit from the political scene, it was a pretty sobering political lesson that everybody was watching. And I think finally, from my own personal experience, a lesson would be local action on the ground. There's no substitute for it. It's still really, really crucial in elections. So I was selected quite late in the day to stand for Luton North. But I put in a lot of effort locally, lots of different, community organizations, hustings, debates, radio interviews, and so on. I put in a lot of effort, and I was proud that the Labour majority was reduced by more than a third in Luton North. So for me, those were the kind of lessons from that election, and why I thought, this time around there was a clear choice.
Well, yeah, and indeed, obviously, Boris Johnson was successful, and the Conservatives were returned with a stonking majority. I think was the term that he used. Well, of course, since then we have officially left the European Union at the end of January, and we were, I'll say, looking forward to some trade discussions, and hopefully formally leaving the European Union at the end of the year. But of course, something has now has turned up. So we're in lockdown at the moment, but obviously that will end, hopefully sooner rather than later. And we'll need to get the economy up and running again. What would you like to see the government do to get things moving?
Yes, you're absolutely right. We were all looking forward to, getting the EU situation concluded, and this is a worldwide pandemic. It's in some cases, in some senses, unprecedented, at least for a very long time. I mean, some of the things, in my view, for the immediate situation, I'm thinking about the testing. I do think the testing needs to keep on improving. I think a lot has already happened, but I think it needs to pick up pace. I'm also picking up, for example, that there might be differences in the way some of the tests are done. I'm not 100% clear on this, but I'm hearing things like the home kit that's received for testing involves inserting a long swab into your nose and then pushing it through there to the back of your throat. That doesn't sound very pleasant, but my understanding is that's what the home kit does. Whereas if you go to the like the so-called drive-in centers where the army does it, it's just a swab at the back of your throat through your mouth. So I'm not certain on this, and you sort of wonder why there's a difference. But that whole testing, I think, needs to be really ramped up. Also, I think the talk of 10 days before you get your result coming through, I think that needs to be improved. I know the government's doing a lot. They're pulling out all the stops on all of this. And we've got to remember this is an unprecedented national effort, but we can always improve. I also think, actually, on the question of personal protective equipment, PPE, there have been rumblings about not using the private sector enough. Now, obviously, the government has said, I recall, for example, Matt Hancock saying they've had some companies that were formed in the last week now applying for government contracts. So you can't have that. We've got to check things properly. We've got to verify the bona fides of potential suppliers. But one would think that established firms could have a much more expedited way of dealing with government procurement. And I think that kind of thing can be improved, because wherever we can get PPE of the right quality, we should be looking at ways to speed that up. And I think another thing to get things going, at some point at least, I think we've got to look at the culture of the public sector. It's kind of long, ponderous committees, slow decision-making processes. And I've done some work, in my own work life, a fair amount consulting to the public sector. There's a sort of bias towards caution and inaction. I think that kind of thing at the best of times is not the best way to do things. But in the situation we have today, it could potentially be lethal. So I think, these are the sorts of areas we've got to look at to get things moving.
So once we've moved out of this stage, either gradually or eventually, is there anything you'd like to see the government do to get the economy up and running so we can get somewhere near back to where we were and moving forward from that point?
Well, I think the support that's been provided for for example, people being able to go on the furlough scheme. There's been more help for self-employed people. Perhaps some of that could stay in place longer while companies get back on their feet. I think the provision of loans and grants, particularly to smaller businesses, if it could be simplified and speeded up. I'm hearing better news on that recently. When it first started, a lot of particularly small businesses were saying they're having to fill in the same old forms and go through the same procedure with the banks, and it takes a very long time. But their problem is cash flow. It's the old what's the saying? Revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, cash is king. And if you haven't got the cash, you need it now. So I think those kind of areas, particularly for small businesses, if things can be speeded up to get cash to people who need it quickly, that's the area I think we need to look at. Keep on going on. Is that the right English? Keeping on going on those fronts.
Well, back to the political day job, as it were.
Yeah.
When you've finished running the country, as it were, you've now represented two different areas in Croydon as a councillor. What are the main issues that you've seen come up, and what do you see impacting Croydon that may be different from other areas?
Yes, so I represented Coulsdon West for 2 terms, and now I'm representing Addiscombe East. So they are different in some ways. Coulsdon actually still has vestiges of resentment that they are even a part of Croydon. They don't like being a part of Croydon. So there are some people who still have that problem, even though I think the decision goes back to the 60s.
I can account to that.
So the issues that I dealt with over there, they were mainly around inappropriate planning applications. I remember there were traffic issues near one of the new local supermarkets, but also around how the Labour Council were going to, as usual, ignore local people in their plans for the local community centre. So those are sorts of issues. But in my first term in Coulsdon West, I was also heavily involved in seeing the new Cane Hill development come into fruition. So at that time, the Conservatives ran the council, and it was a very complete contrast to the way we see things being done under the present Labour administration. So, for example, Cane Hill, it's a beautiful example of homes and flats built on previously unused land, which provides accommodation to people who need it. And we were very careful when we put Cane Hill in place that it was connected to the existing Coulsdon town. And I don't know if you know, there's a place called Netherton on the Hill just as you go towards the M25. We didn't want it to be another Netherton on the Hill, which is quite isolated and not connected to anywhere else. So it's an example of doing things, in my view, in the right way. But if you contrast that with Labour, they are allowing residential homes to be converted into flats anywhere and everywhere. And not just allowing it, they're positively encouraging it. So we know developers know that Croydon is the place to come if you want your planning applications approved. Everybody knows that. But for people who live here, it's becoming a blight on residential streets. If you compare it with other areas, for example, neighbouring Sutton and Bromley, they have not signed up to these really quite onerous housing targets that Labour's council in Croydon have signed up to. My understanding is that the Mayor of London has questioned why Croydon's housing target is so high. So for me, the key word here is inappropriate. Everybody understands we need more housing, and we need housing of different types. So it can't all be flats. We can't just have houses being converted into flats and nothing else. We need small, medium, large family homes as well. And these need to be done in a manner that is sensitive to the existing area. But my fear is, as long as Labour keep running Croydon, the current pretty awful situation is going to continue. So for me, those are the issues that we have to deal with in Croydon.
Well, thanks, Jeet, and it's Mike here.
Hi, Mike.
You've mentioned the Labour council now, and they've now won the last 2 council elections in Croydon. What do you think are going to be the key issues and ways the Conservatives can make a comeback in our town?
Well, one is really clear messaging. So I'll give you an example on this. We still find, I found it surprising when I first started, and I still find it. When we knock on doors, a lot of people do not know that it's Labour who control the council. A lot of people just don't know about the difference between, people are getting on with their lives. They don't think about the council and the national government and things like that. So those of us who are involved in politics, I think we sometimes lose sight of it. A lot of people, they think the Conservatives run the council because, Boris is in number 10. So we've got to be really, really clear. Labour are the ones running the council. Clear communication is going to be key in this. I also think a lot of people still have a bit of an old-fashioned view about the Conservative Party, that perhaps they're all white people and they're all sort of older people and stuff like that. So we need to be much more inclusive on that. I think we've done a lot on that, particularly in the local Croydon Conservatives. We've done a lot on that. So, we've made huge strides on getting a wide range of people now becoming members of the party. We've had people from all parts of the community standing as candidates. So we need to carry on and keep on that and make sure that's visible to people. But also in terms of the issues, planning and development, as I've spoken about, we need to get people to realize it's happening. We need to personalize it. It's going to happen to you. We need to get people to realize if you live on a road, there is every chance the house next door to you is going to be converted into a block of flats. We've got to get that message across. If Labour stay in power, that's very, very possible. And there's also issues around things like traffic. I don't know if you know, but in Addiscombe East, I've been dealing a lot with a completely nightmare situation around what's happening on, for example, Elgin Road and surrounding roads. The way previous Labour councils have allowed a one-way system which starts from East Croydon and goes up towards Shirley, all that traffic problem is going to be a massive issue for us to deal with because there's traffic issues elsewhere as well. And also on things like, how the council is run, the way, for example, children's services, we had a very, very poor rating from the inspector. We had to have external people stepping in. These are examples of how it's very poor at the moment and how we as a Conservative administration can just run things a lot better. So those are the sorts of issues in my mind.
Can I just sort of step in there for me? You mentioned obviously issues around housing and developments and turning houses into flats and building new flats. I think you've got a lot of people moving into Croydon, moving perhaps down from more central locations in London because it's cheaper, yes. And they obviously want somewhere to live. But you've also got a lot of young people who may be from the Croydon area who are looking to get on the housing ladder. And I think some of those people perhaps, they may be into their late 20s now, even into their 30s, and they're, should we say, because they're not getting onto the housing ladder at the moment, they're perhaps not becoming Conservatives, shall we say, because that they still, if you don't own your own property, you're perhaps less likely to be a Conservative than if you do. So how do you think those sort of demographic changes of youngsters and perhaps less than youngsters not being able to get on the housing ladder is going to affect the Conservative Party in places like Croydon, when on the one hand, yes, you've the Conservatives certainly reached out to communities that you've mentioned that perhaps have had a bad view of the Conservatives in the past, But when people want properties, they want somewhere to live. They want to live in Croydon, and they want to perhaps, okay, a flat or what have you. But then on the other hand, you're saying, well, we need to be far more careful about the properties that we're building. How do you think you can speak to those people and persuade them to vote Conservative rather than Labour?
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is certainly a demographic change has been happening and continues to happen in Croydon. There are more people coming into Croydon, and it's great that people want to live in Croydon. For me, it's about we have to provide the right kind of accommodation and a variety of types of accommodation being made available to those who want to come here. But at the same time, those who already live in flats or homes in Croydon, their wishes and desires and rights also need to be protected. And for me, this is not an insoluble problem. I mean, I gave the example of Cane Hill in Coulsdon West. There are alternatives to, in my view, I would call it blighting existing residential streets by converting houses into flats. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the roads in my ward, it was a house. A developer applied to convert the house into 9 flats. Now, and I think it was a 3-bedroom house. Neighbours either side, they said to me, I get it. Young people need accommodation. I was young once. I get it that they need accommodation. But why 9 flats? Why can't it be 5? That's a pretty small house. Why is that allowed to be 9 flats? And where are the cars going to park? How's the infrastructure been factored into coping with that? And those kind of things. And that's the balance I'm talking about. I think even people who may be young and are looking for their first flat, they don't want a poor quality one, and they want to live in a nice place, and they want to make sure that the infrastructure can cope. So for me, it's about getting the balance right. And the way you get the balance right is by being clear that the existing folk are not monsters. They are very understanding folk who want to accommodate more housing provision, but we can do it in the right way and in a sensitive way and the right numbers of them. So talking about numbers, I mentioned earlier, why has Croydon signed up pretty much unilaterally to a far higher housing target than Bromley and Sutton? There is no need for that. We've got to look at the way this is being done in a far more sensible way. That's my point.
Nice, and thanks for that, Jeet. So you were kindly going to come to speak to one of our events on the future of the BBC, which we had to postpone, and we will rearrange. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about the BBC at the moment. How do you feel they've performed during the pandemic?
Well, I mean, overall, I'm a fan of the BBC, and the way I think about this is, if you look at the original John Reith, the Reithian principles of the BBC, which were to inform, educate, and entertain. So if you sort of look at it under those 3 headings, during the pandemic, I would say, in terms of inform, the BBC's got quite amazing resources when you go onto their, the BBC Sounds app, for example. I quite like documentaries personally. So during the pandemic, I've listened to. There was a mid-90s radio series of about 15 or 16 episodes called Civilization, and it started from Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, right up to modern times. I listened to that. I listened to another one on the history of work. And by the way, when you listen to that, apparently the problem all started from when we stopped being hunter-gatherers and became farmers. That's apparently where all the misery started. I also like Melvin Bragg's In Our Time. So all that kind of stuff, I think that's been really good during the pandemic, being able to tap into those resources. Educate, I think, from what I've seen, really good resources for kids. They can access online learning. Entertain, not much comment. It is what it is, depending on your tastes. But on the inform, going back to the inform. So in terms of accessing documentaries and resources, great. But news probably comes under inform. I think there's something to be said about the way news is happening from the BBC. I mean, I would say there's less rigor in how they are coming across as being impartial. So, I mean, an example would be, I think it was just maybe yesterday, there's an article by Laura Koonsberg, whom I otherwise like, and I think she's really good. But her article, the title of it was, and it was in reference to the first time Boris and Keir Starmer have faced each other in the Commons. And the title of it was The Lawyer versus the Showman. And I sort of scratched my head and I thought to myself, well, you know, it's a minor point, but you sort of think, how does that get allowed? You know, why isn't there someone somewhere saying, you know, hang on a minute, that sounds pretty biased. You know, you're obviously trying to put Boris down by calling him the showman and up Starmer a little bit by calling him the lawyer. So that kind of thing is an example of it's not the end of the world. I don't think it makes the BBC evil or anything, but it does indicate that perhaps there's less rigor around how they come across as being impartial. That would be my view about how the BBC has been during the pandemic.
No, and there's an interesting thing though with Boris. There's an attempt there to not suggest that he's perhaps up to it or bright enough, and there's probably not many people who read classics at Oxford who aren't that bright.
Yeah, indeed.
It's yes, it doesn't fit with reality. Okay, well, thanks for that. And so we'll get that rearranged, and hopefully listeners will come along and hear more from you on that subject at the time.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Moving on to perhaps our favourite subject, or the thing we started out life as. Saw a tweet from you a little while back complaining about the council not looking at the opportunities from Brexit. What do you think the opportunities specifically are for Croydon when we're finally fully out of the EU and out of the transition period?
Yeah, so I remember that, and I tweeted about it, and that was a scrutiny and overview committee meeting in the council. Now, just so you understand, the scrutiny and overview committee is supposed to be apolitical. I mean, there's always politics in everything, but that particular committee, you know, comprises Labour and Conservative councillors, and we're not supposed to be political. So what they do in that committee, you have various cabinet members and officers of the council coming in and presenting things like the future strategy or the plans and so on. And in one of those, they had some slides on, you know, Brexit, and they kept on saying there is a threat because of Brexit, and that was where I sort of said to them, and you may have seen it in the clip. I said, well, why have you called that a threat and not an opportunity? So, you know, I'm sure you've done these. Anyone who's done these strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, threat kind of exercises, right? SWOT. And always when you do those kind of things, when you write down a threat, you can also see it as an opportunity, because if you do the opposite, can't you? Right? So for example, Brexit, they put Brexit is a threat because we may lose trade. But you could say, well, Brexit is an opportunity because we can make new trade deals and there's more freedom and there's a different way of doing things. So for me, it was about the mindset. Again, I referred to this earlier, the mindset of the public sector. It's cautious, it's unimaginative, bland, box ticking. It's not thinking in a different way. And for me, that's what that was about. So, you know, I think, you know, Croydon, we should be making connections with the relevant government departments that are right now busy trying to do deals with, you know, other countries and make new trade deals. We need to go and find out who are the key figures in those government departments, what deals are starting to be made, even if they're not there yet. Let's get in on that conversation, get them to know Croydon is a very, very keen partner to benefit from this. We should be thinking about, you know, why can't we go to, for example, to some American firms and say, obviously there's an emerging deal here. I know it hasn't been signed yet, but something is almost certainly going to happen. You know, why don't we talk to some of these? Why doesn't Croydon talk to some of these American firms and say, you know, we'd love you to come and locate into Croydon. when this deal is done? Or, associated services, accounting, legal, banking. Could you have a branch in Croydon? Let's do things. New businesses locating in Croydon. It requires imagination, and that was my point there. To simply keep on saying Brexit equals threat, oh my God, it's so awful. We've got to stop that. We've got to have, it's an opportunity. The people have voted for it. It's happening. Stop it with the misery. Now let's see how we're going to really get good benefits from it, particularly for Croydon.
No, it's a really key point. It always struck me. I remember us as a campaign talking about it at the time. The very multicultural nature of Croydon is a huge opportunity here, where we might do less trade with Europe. We will do more trade with the world. And you pick a country, there's a community group for it in Croydon. That's got to be a strength. That's got to be something you can, in the best possible way, exploit as an opportunity. Yes, yeah, no, it's very, very well put there. Well, thanks for your time again, there, Jeet, and all the best for the future, and in Addiscombe, and representing the people there. Just wonder if there's anything else you want to sort of say before you go. And
no, thank you, Mike and Dan. Just to say, first time I've done one of these, and I really, really enjoyed it. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.